The emergence of the predator. The early 1990s were a time of quiet serenity for the residents in the small town surrounding Black Lake, a sprawling body of water nestled in the heart of the eastern United States. With its pine-lined shores and calm waters, Black Lake was a place for families to enjoy picnics, anglers to cast their lines, and couples to take long reflective walks as the sun set behind the mountains. It was the kind of community where everyone knew each other's names and where life moved just slowly enough to make you forget the troubles of the outside world. But everything began to change. At first, it was just whispers, murmurs of unease that started to spread through the grapevine. Women had started disappearing. Not just any women, though. Seemingly, it was those who lived on the edges of society, women working late-night shifts, dancers in dimly lit clubs, and those who turned to street corners to scrape together a living. For weeks, the talk of missing person flyers tacked up on grocery store bulletin boards and light poles was little more than tragic gossip, until some of those flyers had to be taken down and replaced with reports of bodies being discovered. The first body was found on a drizzly gray morning in May 1991. A group of teenagers wandering the wooded area adjacent to the lake stumbled upon a horrific sight. A woman's lifeless body partially submerged in the icy slate-colored waters of Black Lake. Alarmed and frightened beyond belief, they rushed back to town and told the local authorities. What the investigators uncovered at the scene was chilling. A young woman, barely in her mid-20s, who had died violently. Strangulation marks on her neck left no doubt about the cause of death. Her eyes had a haunting glaze, a silent testament to the terror she had faced in her final moments. This discovery rocked the town to its core. Rumors snowballed. The townsfolk began to wonder if it was just a terrible incident or something far worse. So when another body appeared just weeks later, this time in a forgotten inlet of the lake, the dread began to set in. The law enforcement widened their net, speculating whether the two cases were connected. But whoever was behind these gruesome murders was careful, leaving little behind but the mangled lives of the victims. What unsettled the community most was not just the incidents themselves, but the calculated nature of the killings. Black Lake was remote, bordered by dense forests and winding trails. These weren't random locations. Every crime suggested precision, an intimate understanding of the area, perhaps even a predator who lived among them. Who was this person? A drifter? A neighbor? A shadow slipping between the cabins on the lake's edge? The hunters, the fishermen, and even the retirees who strolled these banks had to question, could the man in the corner booth at the diner know more than he let on? Was the quiet guy who worked maintenance at the lodge hiding a darker side? The newspaper headlines had a name for this possible menace, the Phantom of Black Lake. But the truth was yet to fully emerge, and Black Lake's sense of security would continue to shatter as summer turned to fall and fear took hold of every street corner, every unlit path. This predator wasn't slowing down, he was only getting started. The predator targets the vulnerable. When the killings around Black Lake began, the community was reluctant to believe they were the work of a serial predator. But as the bodies began to pile up, a pattern emerged, one that soon became impossible to ignore. The victims weren't random. They were women who lived their lives in the shadows, women society saw but didn't always notice, women who were, as many whispered darkly, easier to forget. In smaller towns like those near Black Lake, the edges of society blurred in the late hours of the night, bars closed, streets emptied, and only a few figures remained. Some were clad in short skirts or sequined tops, leaning casually against lampposts or huddling near convenience stores waiting for the next deal or customer. These weren't the kind of women most people mentioned over dinner conversations. They were outsiders, women working the streets, traveling from town to town, gliding through the margins. These women often walked a treacherous path between danger and survival. To stay alive, they believed in instincts and in their ability to read whoever stepped out of a car and into their orbit. But no amount of experience could prepare them for whoever the killer was. The predator was calculated. He had a type, and it was clear he knew how to pick them. He didn't hunt during the day, didn't prey on women who had strong family ties or the kind of connections that would make them harder to track, or easier to miss. He targeted sex workers, drifters, and women grappling with addiction, lives often lived in quiet desperation, and he hunted them under the cover of night, blending in like the shadow that came before the scream. No one could say for certain how or where he approached his victims, but there were theories. Often the women were seen last simply doing what they did every evening, standing at the edge of dimly lit intersections, leaning into cars after a quick head turn. To some, they were nameless and faceless, simply part of the scenery that the rest of the town ignored. But to him, they were prey, vulnerable prey. Local law enforcement quickly pieced together that many of these women weren't reported missing right away, some not even after weeks. Their lives were transient by necessity, always moving from one city, one corner to the next. For the predator, this was his greatest advantage. He could offer a ride, earn their trust, or at least convince them he didn't pose a threat, and they'd be gone before anyone even knew to look for them. No nosy neighbors, no immediate search parties, just silence. There was another layer to his unsettling MO, the psychological power he held over his victims. The predator seemed to know how to disarm them. Locals speculated about his demeanor. Was it kind and reassuring, offering the kind of trustworthiness that came with a casual smile or a soft tone? Did he make himself seem familiar, as though he were just another local, blending in against the backdrop of the sleepy Black Lake? Or did he wield an unspoken menace, allowing his victims to sense the danger only when it was too late? And it wasn't just the women themselves who were kept vulnerable. It was the system meant to keep them safe that left them exposed. Law enforcement resources were stretched thin, and the missing women didn't spark immediate outcry from the community. To many, they were troubled women, as the media called them. The ugly truth was simple: their lives didn't move the needle of public concern. If the women themselves weren't forgotten, their stories often were. This lack of urgency allowed the predator to claim more victims. One by one he took them, each disappearance feeding a growing fear that a killer was lurking in the dark. Perhaps most chilling of all was the idea that the predator had studied his victims for some time. Some locals even began to theorize that he could have been one of them, someone who led an unassuming life among the community, blending seamlessly into the mundane routines of small-town life. Others speculated he might have been a drifter himself, someone intimately familiar with their world, their struggles, their habits, and their vulnerabilities. The killer's methods painted a cruel picture of someone both patient and deliberate. He didn't just pick victims at random, each one was part of a calculated choice. And the women who walked those dimly lit paths at night had no way of knowing that they were being watched, followed, and ultimately ensnared. By the time law enforcement and the community began to truly grasp the scope of what was happening, it was too late for many of the women. Flyers and bulletins with blurry photographs littered storefront windows and telephone poles, bearing the names and faces of women who had slipped through society's cracks. And as soon as one victim was discovered, another would quickly follow, sending a clear, bone-chilling message. The predator wasn't finished. He was thriving. For the residents of Black Lake's surrounding towns, the realization was heartbreaking and terrifying all at once. Someone among them was a hunter. And as long as the predator stayed hidden in plain sight, more women would fall victim to his unrelenting need to prey upon those who had no one left to fight for them. The first victim. It was a brisk, early spring morning on May 2, 1991, when the silence around Black Lake was shattered by a grim discovery. The sun had barely risen, its pale light struggling to pierce through the gray clouds that hung low over the horizon. A jogger, pedaling slowly on a rusty old bike along the gravel path near the lake, noticed something unusual just below the surface of the water. From the distance, it looked like nothing more than white driftwood tangled in reeds, a common sight in the isolated countryside. But as they drew closer, a chill spread down their spine. The shape wasn't driftwood, it was a body. Panicked and trembling, the jogger dropped their bike on the muddy shore and sprinted to the nearest fishing lodge to call for help. Within hours, local law enforcement arrived, swarming the scene. Detectives, forensic photographers, and a medical examiner huddled around the body as it was gingerly pulled from Black Lake's icy waters. What they uncovered would start a chain of events that the peaceful community could never have imagined. The victim was a young woman, barely in her mid-20s, later identified as Claire M. Thompson. She had been reported missing a week earlier, a report that, at the time, had caused little alarm. Claire wasn't the kind of girl anyone thought much of. She lived alone, worked as a waitress at a roadside diner, and kept to herself. She had no close family in the area, and no steady boyfriend, just an unsteady paycheck and a few acquaintances who would sometimes spot her walking home late at night, her head bowed beneath the dim streetlights. But now, Claire was the center of attention. Drawn from the murky lake water, her once-alive body was a silent tableau of violence. The autopsy would later confirm what officers already suspected: Claire's death had been no accident. Bruises encircled her neck, leaving a clear impression of the force that had strangled the life out of her. The medical examiner noted several abrasions on her wrists and ankles, suggesting she may have been bound. But what truly haunted the investigating officers were the smaller details. Her lips were slightly parted, revealing teeth that had been clenched in terror during her final moments. Her eyes, glazed and wide open, stared blankly into the ether, almost as if still frozen in fear. And as the evidence mounted, one thing was clear. This was no chance killing, it was methodical. Although the forensics team carefully combed the scene, they found only fleeting traces of what her last hours might have been like. A broken heel lay half buried in the mud nearby, possibly from a struggle. There were faint marks, perhaps tire tracks, on the embankment leading down to the shore, though the surrounding terrain made it nearly impossible to determine whether they were connected to the killer's vehicle. Worse still, her personal belongings, purse, Idaho, and even her clothing, were nowhere to be found. The police soon discovered Claire's tragic backstory, piecing together fragments of her short life. Originally from out of town, she had moved to the area just 6 months earlier, renting a tiny, run-down apartment across from a convenience store. Nobody quite knew why she had come to Black Lake, a place people were more likely to leave than arrive at. To make ends meet, she took the late-night shifts at a diner on Route 28, a long, lonely stretch of road leading in and out of town. It was also the last place anyone reported seeing her. That night, according to a coworker, Claire had clocked out shortly after midnight. She had spoken briefly about her plans for the evening, maybe grabbing a drink at a nearby dive bar, maybe just heading home. But whatever she intended to do, she never made it back. Somewhere along that desolate road she vanished. For a town like Black Lake, a horrific event like this wasn't just a shock, it was an existential breakdown. Neighbors whispered about it over coffee at the diner, mothers clutched their children closer. The dozens of missing person flyers taped in clusters to telephone poles were no longer just abstract faces. They were Claire's face now. She was one of them. Her death hit too close to home. The police chief, a grizzled and weary man named Tom Heller, stood before a gaggle of reporters that afternoon. "We will not rest," he declared, voice laced with urgency, "until we bring whoever did this to justice." But beneath his calm facade, he felt the weight of a terrifying truth. Claire's murder wasn't a random act of violence. The evidence pointed to someone who had done this before, or someone who would do it again. Heller wasn't wrong. Less than 3 weeks later, another body surfaced in the shallow waters of a stream feeding into Black Lake. And just like Claire, this second victim bore the same brutal hallmarks: strangulation, assault, and abandonment, as though her life had been nothing more than disposable. The once idyllic community along Black Lake was now gripped with fear. People began locking their doors at night, double-checking on their loved ones, and scrutinizing the faces of strangers passing through town. The bustling diners and small-town fairs that had been gathering places now seemed the perfect hunting ground for a nameless terror creeping among them. Claire Thompson would not be the last victim of Black Lake's phantom, but she was the first. And her senseless death marked the beginning of a nightmare that would plague this quiet pocket of the country for years to come. A string of horrifying murders. The discovery of Claire Thompson's lifeless body should have been a wake-up call, a galvanizing force propelling the town of Black Lake and the surrounding authorities into hypervigilance. But it wasn't. Within weeks after Claire's body had been found, the small town's worst fears materialized. Another body surfaced. Then another. What had once been an aberration was now beginning to feel like a grim ritual, conducted by hands unseen but terrifyingly familiar. The second victim, discovered barely 3 weeks after Claire, was found along a muddy inlet, her body hidden amongst thick reeds. She was young, like Claire, her life abruptly snatched away before it had ever truly begun. Deep bruising around the neck once again told the same story of strangulation. And like Claire, she had suffered physical and emotional violence in her final moments. Though her identity was eventually confirmed as Alyssa Gray, a 21-year-old local who had been reported missing after a night out downtown, her life was already reduced in the public eye to only the circumstances of her death. The town was shaken, but the shock had not yet reached its peak. In the weeks following Alyssa's discovery, bodies turned up with alarming frequency. Each discovery seemed to come closer and closer together, as if the predator was no longer content to keep his distance between crimes. A chilling sense of escalation began to grip the investigators, as well as the town. Local papers began churning out sensationalized headlines: "Black Lake Stalker Strikes Again," "Walking in the Shadows," and ominously, "Death Along the Shoreline." The news wasn't limited to the surrounding counties anymore. Television stations from bigger cities sent in curious reporters, staking out at diners or interviewing exhausted law enforcement officers. In a town once known for lazy Sunday afternoons and summer boating tournaments, attention now swirled with fear, suspicion, and dread. What puzzled law enforcement most was how organized yet relentless the predator seemed to be. His victims were eerily similar. Most were women in their late teens or early 20s, often struggling to make ends meet, and several had been sex workers who operated near the outskirts of the nearby cities. It was clear the killer had a type. These victims were vulnerable by every definition of the word, disconnected from their families, unnoticed by their communities, and frequently living in transient spaces where their disappearance might not immediately alarm those around them. Everybody told the same story. A woman's life had been snuffed out with little visible regard for humanity. Strangulation marks lined their necks like morbid signatures, their bodies discarded like trash in places just remote enough to suggest planning but not so remote that they couldn't be found eventually. It was almost as if the killer wanted them to be discovered, as if it brought him some twisted satisfaction to see the ripples of fear and grief radiate through the town. Word of the murders began spreading far beyond Black Lake's quiet boundaries. Truck drivers passing through the area at night refused to stop unless absolutely necessary. Residents started arming themselves with padlocks, hunting rifles, and kitchen knives tucked beneath their pillows. Even the brave few who dared to venture into Black Lake after sunset rarely went alone. Every crunch of dry leaves in the woods, every shadow behind them became a potential threat. But it wasn't until the fifth victim's body surfaced in the fall of 1991 that the full scale of the nightmare became undeniable. Found tangled among driftwood on the eastern shore of the lake, 19-year-old Marissa Green had been missing for nearly a month. Her death bore the same marks of cruelty that the others had endured, but there was something new this time. Her body had been posed in a degrading position, almost as though the killer was taunting anyone who might dare to find her. It was a grotesque departure from the faceless anonymity with which he'd discarded the first four. "The killer's evolving," said Detective Samuel Ortiz in a rare public statement. "It's not enough for him to take their lives. He wants to send a message." His words hardened the pit of unease growing within the community. If the killings were meant as a message, what kind of nightmare would unfold as the predator's confidence grew? And more pressing, how long before he struck again? Despite the similarities between the murders and the growing evidence connecting the cases, the police were at a loss. The Black Lake Sheriff's Office simply wasn't equipped to handle something as catastrophic as serial murders. They were trained to break up bar fights, track down stolen farm equipment, or deal with runaway teenagers. Tracking a cunning, systematic murderer wasn't on the list of typical duties. The local radio became a soapbox for frightened residents, calling in with theories ranging from outlandish to unnervingly plausible. Some said it had to be an out-of-towner, someone who had drifted into Black Lake for just long enough to feed his appetite before vanishing back into the void. Others speculated that the killer could be one of their own, a trusted member of the community whose dark side would shock them all if exposed. Meanwhile, the predator wasn't slowing down, and he wasn't limiting himself. Bodies began appearing in the wooded trails around the lake, beyond just the water's edge. One victim was found in a shallow grave, her body still bound with ropes. Another was discovered in an abandoned shack, left there for days before being noticed by a traveling birdwatcher. Every crime spoke volumes about the killer's familiarity with the area, about how he moved through its secrets with precision and ease. He owned it in a way that few others could. For the families of the victims, the devastation was immeasurable. They called on law enforcement to work harder, to be smarter. "Find him," pleaded the mother of the sixth victim during a tearful press conference. "Don't let anyone else's daughter end up like mine." Over time, a name began circulating among the community and in the papers: the Phantom of Black Lake. Fitting, given how invisible and unreachable the predator seemed. Black Lake, once tranquil and picturesque, was now host to the kind of name that children would shiver hearing about in hushed tones as they refused to stray too far from home. But the Phantom wasn't worried. With every victim, his methods became sharper, his brutality more pronounced. And in the absence of any real leads or progress, people began to wonder if catching him was even possible. The string of murders wasn't just a sign of savage violence, it was evidence of a hunter's growing mastery, a predator who had found the perfect playground, and who wasn't leaving anytime soon. The investigation stalls. As the bodies continued to surface around Black Lake, The fear gripping the town quickly turned to frustration and despair. By the fall of 1991, local law enforcement had been working tirelessly for months, but with little to show for their efforts. Despite mounting pressure from the community and growing media attention, the investigation was stalled, mired in dead ends and unanswered questions. The initial problem was obvious: the sheriff's department in Black Lake wasn't equipped to handle this kind of horror. The police force was small, barely staffed with 2 detectives and a handful of patrol officers more accustomed to breaking up bar fights and chasing runaway dogs than hunting a serial killer. Their tools were outdated, their methods traditional, and their experience limited to the kinds of minor crimes that rarely made headlines. Now, they were facing a cunning predator who seemed always to be one step ahead. Every new body brought a renewed sense of urgency, and new layers of frustration. Each crime scene was carefully examined by forensics, but the killer was meticulous. He left little, if any, physical evidence behind. No fingerprints, no DNA, nothing. By the time a body was found, the surrounding area had often been contaminated by the elements or curious passers-by. The most they could hope for were faint tire tracks, incomplete boot prints in the mud, or stray fibers that led nowhere when tested. Detective Samuel Ortiz, one of the few officers with experience in violent crimes, was particularly haunted by the case. He arrived at each crime scene with high hopes, only to leave hours later with a pit in his stomach. "He's a ghost," Ortiz admitted to his team during one late-night strategy meeting at the station. "He's moving in and out of this town like he knows every back road, every hidden spot. It's like he's lived here his whole life, or he's studied it better than we have." As the weeks stretched into months, the task force expanded, but not without complications. The state police and FBI were eventually asked to assist, bringing in profilers and tech specialists in an attempt to cobble together a psychological portrait of the killer. The profilers were helpful in some respects, describing the predator as methodical, a likely loner with a deep-seated hatred toward women, possibly someone who enjoyed blending in with his surroundings. "He's not going to stand out," one profiler warned during a town meeting. "He could be the guy bagging your groceries, fixing your car, or sitting 2 rows behind you in church." This vague assessment did little to quell the town's fears, and for the police, it only added to the overwhelming challenge of catching an unseen enemy. Another obstacle was the sheer unpredictability of the killer's movements. He didn't seem to follow a fixed schedule. Sometimes weeks would pass between killings, other times only days. He struck in different locations around the lake, making it nearly impossible for officers to patrol effectively. Efforts to create a perimeter or predict his next move were useless. Black Lake was too large, its surrounding forests too dense, its network of trails and dirt roads too vast. There were simply too many places to hide. Even the townspeople, once eager to help, began to turn against the investigation. As nights grew longer and colder, those who were once supportive of the sheriff's department became restless and distrustful. Accusations of incompetence started to surface in local gossip and editorial letters to the town's small newspaper. "They've got no idea what they're doing," one resident remarked bitterly during a town hall meeting. "How many more girls need to die before they do something?" Worse yet, the stigma surrounding the victims themselves began to creep into the broader narrative of the case. Many of the women were sex workers, drifters, or women struggling with addiction, people living on the margins of society. Some residents openly questioned whether law enforcement was putting in their best effort. "If these were church-going mothers or daughters," one woman argued during another community meeting, "you'd have caught him by now." That comment struck a raw nerve even among the officers themselves, who felt the burden of unspoken judgment as the victim count increased. Internally, the investigation team also faced growing tensions. Detectives clashed over theories, each more desperate than the last. One officer believed the crimes were the work of a transient trucker passing through the county, picking off victims before disappearing back onto the interstate highway. Another was convinced the killer was local, hiding in plain sight among the people of Black Lake. Still others speculated that the murderer could be a tourist, someone who came to the lake under the guise of camping or fishing, using its isolation as a cover for horrific actions. But with no solid evidence, every theory was just conjecture. Adding insult to injury, media coverage painted an unflattering portrait of the investigation. National news outlets descended on the town, broadcasting sensationalized stories about the Phantom of Black Lake. Anchors speculated wildly about the police's inability to contain the threat, feeding a growing public paranoia. Camera crews followed officers as they patrolled the lake's trails, their recorded frustration and weariness feeding the narrative of a force overwhelmed and outmatched. By the end of 1992, a full year after Claire Thompson's body had first been pulled from the lake, there had been no arrests, no serious suspects, and no public breakthroughs. Officers grew visibly exhausted, some losing sleep over the lingering shadow of the phantom. For Detective Ortiz, the case became an obsession. His office was plastered with maps and timelines, each murder marked with red pins connected by strings of twine. He spent more time at his desk than at home, his personal life unraveling as the case stubbornly stagnated. The culmination of the many frustrations came one crisp November morning when yet another body was found on the lake's northeastern bank. The victim, only 18 years old, had been missing for 2 weeks. Her body told the same story: strangulation, violence, and abandonment. For Ortiz, it was the tipping point. "We're not catching him in time," he whispered bitterly to a colleague as the medical examiner zipped up the body bag. "And every day we fail, he gets bolder." Internally, the investigation team moved to double down on their efforts, but there was no escaping the grim reality. The Phantom was winning. He was outsmarting them at every turn, preying on their blind spots with terrifying precision, and while the police worked in circles, he was already planning his next move. A surviving witness. By the time 1992 rolled around, the fear surrounding Black Lake had settled into the marrow of the community, like an unshakable chill that wouldn't go away. The murders had all but paralyzed the small towns scattered around the water's edge. Women stopped walking alone at night. Families moved away. Each new body that surfaced served as another reminder that no one in Black Lake was truly safe. But then, something happened that no one, the police, the desperate media, or the frightened townsfolk, had dared hope for. Someone survived. Her name was Linda Harrington, a 28-year-old woman from a neighboring city who had been living a transient life. She described herself as a rolling stone, traveling from town to town and not staying long enough to put down roots. She worked odd jobs when she could, mostly bartending shifts or dancing at small clubs. By virtue of her nomadic lifestyle, Linda fit the killer's profile perfectly, a lone figure on the fringes of society. And one cold February evening, she found herself face to face with Black Lake's infamous predator. Linda later recounted the ordeal to detectives in vivid, harrowing detail. She had been standing outside the diner where she'd worked the night shift, waiting for a ride that never came. It was late, almost midnight, and the street was eerily quiet, lit only by the faint orange glow of a single flickering street lamp. Cold seeped into her skin as she zipped her worn jacket tighter and cursed the bad luck of being stranded. That was when she noticed the car. It pulled up slowly, almost drifting, its tires crunching against the icy gravel. The man behind the wheel rolled down the passenger side window and flashed her a disarming smile. He looked ordinary, average build, a little gray at the temples, neatly dressed in work clothes that suggested he'd just come off a shift himself. Linda described nothing about him that screamed danger. He wasn't particularly big, intimidating, or imposing. If anything, she remembered him as polite, almost fatherly. "You need a ride?" he had asked. Under normal circumstances, Linda might have turned him down. She'd been careful before, having learned the lessons of survival that came with living on the margins. But the temperature was plummeting, and the streets were empty. The prospect of standing out there for another hour didn't appeal to her. Something about the man struck her as safe enough to take a chance on, and that decision almost cost her life. The drive started out uneventfully. The man made small talk, asking harmless questions, where she was from, where she worked, things that seemed like ordinary chatter to fill the silence. Linda admitted later that this initial ease had made her let her guard down, but as the car veered off the main road, heading toward the darker, more isolated outskirts of town, an unsettling realization settled in her gut. "This isn't the right way," she said. The man's tone shifted, the warmth in his voice hardened into cold detachment. "It's fine," he replied. "I just want to show you something." Panic surged through Linda as she gripped the door handle, but the lock was already engaged. Her instincts screamed at her to act, and she did. In a desperate move, she reached for the door anyway, trying to yank it open even as the car sped up. That was when he struck her. A sudden, vicious blow to the side of her head that almost made her black out. But Linda wouldn't go quietly. She was a fighter, resourceful in ways the predator hadn't anticipated. As he slowed the car to navigate a narrow, winding road, she feigned unconsciousness. It was her only chance. When the car came to a stop near the woods, his hunting grounds, she made her move. Summoning every ounce of strength, Linda grabbed a half-full bottle she spotted on the floor of the car and swung it into his face with all her might. The man howled in surprise and pain, momentarily dazed. It was the opening Linda needed. She kicked the door open, tumbled out of the car and started running. The sharp winter air sliced at her lungs, and the darkness of the trees swallowed her. She didn't stop to look back, even as she heard him cursing and thrashing through the underbrush behind her. She ran until her legs gave out, collapsing near the edge of a small residential street. A porch light flickered in the distance. Safety was within reach. When she stumbled to the door, bleeding and trembling uncontrollably, the homeowners called the police immediately. Officers arrived within minutes, though by the time they reached the dirt road where Linda had fled from the man, the car was gone. The predator had vanished, retreating into the night like a ghost, leaving no traces behind, but this time he left something he hadn't before: a survivor. In the days that followed, Linda provided detectives with a detailed description of the man. She spoke of his calm demeanor, the way he made her feel at ease just long enough to lure her into his trap. She remembered his voice, a soft, almost soothing tone that belied the monster within. "He was the kind of guy you don't see coming," she told them in one interview. "There's nothing special about him, that's what makes him so dangerous." Her account proved to be a critical turning point for law enforcement. She was the first living person to have ever encountered him and made it out alive. Her story not only confirmed suspicions about the meticulous nature of the killer, but also revealed his potential vulnerability. For the first time, the Phantom of Black Lake had made a mistake. He had underestimated someone. But even with this new lead, the investigation remained daunting. The man's average appearance and lack of identifying details made him nearly impossible to track. Still, Linda's survival breathed fresh urgency into the hunt. Law enforcement ramped up efforts, distributing composite sketches to nearby towns and setting up checkpoints throughout the area. News outlets ran headlines like, "Phantom Slips, Victim Escapes." The community, though still living in fear, started to believe that the killer wasn't invincible. For Linda, the ordeal left scars far beyond the physical. She struggled to sleep, waking up in cold sweats from nightmares of the man's face, his voice weaving into her subconscious like a dark thread she couldn't unravel. Despite this, she chose to face her fears head-on. When asked why she was so forthcoming about her story, Linda's answer was simple: "I'm alive. I have to fight for the ones who didn't make it." Her bravery became a rallying cry for the shattered community. But even as hope flickered, the Phantom wasn't done. Somewhere in the cold woods surrounding Black Lake, he was still out there, watching and waiting. The killer strikes again. Linda Harrington's daring escape did something the authorities hadn't yet been able to do. It proved that the killer was mortal, capable of slipping up. Her story gave law enforcement their first tangible glimpse into the Phantom of Black Lake. For a brief moment, the community let out a shallow sigh of relief. If someone like Linda could survive, maybe justice wasn't such a distant dream after all. But this murderer had no interest in fading quietly into the shadows. Linda's survival wasn't a setback, it was a provocation. And nothing enraged him more than the idea that his prey could get away. Black Lake wasn't safe. The killer hadn't disappeared after Linda's escape. In fact, he became more emboldened than ever. Within weeks of her ordeal, a fresh wave of violence descended upon the towns near the lake. It began subtly at first: whispers of wandering women gone missing, a local barmaid who clocked out after her shift but never made it home, an abandoned car parked along a desolate highway with the keys still in the ignition. And then, of course, there were the bodies. The next victim was found just 2 weeks after Linda's escape. Her body washed up along a murky stream feeding into Black Lake. She was in her early 20s with long dark hair, and though there were signs of familiarity in the killer's methods, there was also something different now. The violence was escalating. Her wrists showed evidence of prolonged restraints, and the bruises around her neck were deeper, as though the killer had taken extra care to make her suffering last. The medical examiner noted this grim evolution, and word soon spread. The killer was angry. Linda had shattered the illusion of divine control he held over his victims, and he was taking his rage out on the others. Police worked feverishly to analyze the evidence from this new crime scene, combing through tire imprints, broken branches, and muddy footprints for any clue that could bring them closer to the Phantom. But just like before, he moved with precision, clean, careful, deliberate. The officers realized quickly that he was watching them, studying their patterns, predicting their moves. "This isn't a kill-and-run kind of guy," said Detective Ortiz during a late-night strategy meeting. He's treating this like a chess game and we're pawns in it. His rampage didn't stop there. Another girl disappeared from the edge of town a few days later, and then another. The timeline between his murders grew shorter and shorter, until it became clear that the Phantom was no longer interested in hiding. He wanted attention. He wanted them to feel how powerless they were. And each new victim he claimed seemed to tell a story, a grim statement of his control and a chilling reminder that he was untouchable. The murders became ritualistic, the killer experimenting with the discarded bodies. Some victims were left in poses, their lifeless forms contorted into macabre displays that he seemed to want the public to witness. Others were found in places more remote, their discovery delayed for weeks or even months as the woods swallowed them whole. It was as though the predator was bifurcated, one part of him craving exposure, desperate to taunt the police, and another part enjoying the private satisfaction of his isolated hunt. New rumors began to spread. Residents swore they had seen suspicious figures lingering near the wooded trails, staring too long at darkened streets, or loitering near gas stations late at night. Truckers passing through avoided Black Lake altogether, while locals were forced to confront the painful truth. Anyone could be the predator. The quiet neighbor who waved at kids on their way to school. The friendly clerk who stocked shelves at the grocery store. The guy pumping gas alongside you at the station. He could be anyone, one terrified mother said on a local news broadcast. He could be right behind you, and you'd never know until it was too late. The anomalies behind the killer's behaviors began to haunt law enforcement in their sleep. Why was he accelerating? Was Linda's escape the catalyst? Or had he always intended to ramp up the frequency of his crimes, building toward some horrific crescendo that none of them could predict? Detective Ortiz reflected on it late into the night, staring at the red lines on his crime scene map, which now branched like a spider's web around Black Lake. One thing became clear to him: the killer wasn't just driven by impulse. He had a plan, a vision, and the people of Black Lake were just unwitting characters in his violent masterpiece. But there was an even darker subtlety to his spree. The first few murders were precise, calculated with an air of professional detachment. Now they reeked of spite. The killer wasn't just hunting anymore, he was lashing out. The survivors had embarrassed him, challenged his control, and that challenge was like a splinter he couldn't remove. For each woman who escaped or fought back, another life was snuffed out with twice the fury. One particularly grisly discovery came in late April of 1992, a holiday weekend when families were supposed to be crowding near Black Lake to enjoy the beginning of spring. Instead, the body of a young woman was discovered floating face down in the shallow reeds near the bustling marina. This time the victim's body displayed clear signs of brutal torture. Deep cuts and bruises littered her arms and legs, and her wrists were covered in rope burns that showed an extended period of confinement. Law enforcement and forensic analysts agreed. This killing in particular was meant to send a message. The Phantom wasn't just a killer anymore, he was a monster. And the monster wanted them to know he was watching. For the families of victims, hope turned into desperation. They pleaded on live broadcasts with trembling voices, begging the community to stay vigilant, begging the police to work harder, begging the killer himself, even knowing it was futile, to stop. "Why are you doing this?" cried the sister of one victim during a televised press conference. "They're people, they're daughters and friends. What happened to you that you need to hurt so many innocent women?" The Phantom, of course, remained silent, but his violence spoke louder than any words ever could. By the summer of 1992, Black Lake was a ghost town. The once thriving fishing villages and tourist hubs were boarded up and lifeless. Businesses shut their doors early, strangers gave each other suspicious looks, and every unlit alleyway felt like a hunting ground waiting to be claimed. State patrols increased, curfews were suggested, and a handful of new search dogs were dispatched into the forested trails around the lake. But for every patrol route the police guarded, the Phantom simply found a new shadowy corner to lurk in. The authorities and townsfolk alike were asking the same terrifying question. What was the Phantom building toward? Striking with such ferocity and frequency could only mean one thing. He was chasing something larger than his kills, something more profound than even the violence he embodied. What frightened Chief Heller most was not knowing where the end of the killer's spiral might lead. Would he stop of his own volition? Or was he planning something so terrible that the murders up to this point were just part of the warm-up? The Phantom wasn't slowing down. The nightmare of Black Lake was far from over. The killer's mistake. For over 3 years, the Phantom of Black Lake operated like a ghost, a faceless, nameless predator whose violence left no trail, whose steps never seemed to crush a single leaf, and whose existence was known only through the bodies he left behind. He was meticulous, precise, untouchable. Every crime he committed showcased his control, his ability to outmaneuver the authorities and disappear before anyone knew where to look. But even the smartest predator eventually makes a mistake. And in late 1994, more than 4 years after the first body was pulled from Black Lake, the Phantom faltered. He left behind a clue that would turn the tide against him. It wasn't much. In fact, at first, it barely seemed like anything at all. The scene was chillingly familiar. A young woman discovered in the dense woods bordering Black Lake, her body concealed beneath a blanket of leaves and pine needles. By the time she was found, decomposition had set in, erasing much of the forensic evidence that could have otherwise told the story of her final hours. But something unusual caught the attention of the forensics team. A hair, caught in the fibers of an old rope still loosely tied around the victim's wrists. It was short, coarse, and distinctly male. DNA. At the time, DNA analysis was still a developing field. Matches took weeks, sometimes months, and solving crimes using genetic evidence was far from the standard it would become in the decades that followed. But even in its infancy, DNA technology had just reached a critical tipping point. Local investigators, overwhelmed and desperate, sent the hair sample to a state-of-the-art lab several hours away, knowing it was the best chance they had at breaking the case. What they didn't know was that this one small fragment of the killer himself would unravel the carefully built image he had constructed of invincibility. The process was painstaking. The lab worked for weeks, isolating the genetic material, comparing it against national databases that were still relatively new. The first results were inconclusive. There wasn't a direct match on file. Weeks turned into months. Frustration rumbled through the task force in Black Lake, as the DNA didn't immediately lead to the kind of revelation they had hoped for. But they knew they had something valuable now, something the Phantom hadn't counted on. His DNA could be tied irrevocably to his crimes. The hair, overlooked in thousands of other murders, was the beginning of his unraveling. Unlike the murderer, law enforcement began moving more methodically. They combed through every detail, revisiting past crime scenes and re-interviewing anyone who might have spotted anything unusual in the years since 1990. The small semblance of DNA evidence brought forth renewed determination. Officers now believed that time was on their side, even if they couldn't immediately identify a suspect. The DNA could wait. Technology was improving faster than the Phantom could run, and one way or another it wouldn't be long until his past caught up with him. But fate wouldn't make the police wait much longer. The mountain of pressure weighed on the Phantom himself in ways no one in Black Lake could have expected. For years he had operated without fear, yet he had grown used to the idea of his own infallibility. He hadn't left a single shred of himself behind at his earlier crime scenes, a fact that fueled his sense of control. But mistakes, even for someone as meticulous as him, began to happen when he took risks and escalated his violence. Somewhere deep inside him he knew he'd miscalculated. That single hair, the tiniest fragment of evidence, set off a spark of panic. It showed in his actions. For the next few months, law enforcement noticed a shift. His killings didn't stop, but they became less regular, less predictable. He started altering his methods. His usual hunting grounds around Black Lake were abandoned for more remote locations farther and farther away from the lake's shores. His victims were discovered in deeper forested areas, dumped in rivers that carried their remains miles away before they were found. But despite his attempts to cover his tracks, his patterns, his signature, still lingered at every scene. His victims all still bore the signs of his merciless touch, and it was only a matter of time before the noose tightened. Then, in the early winter of 1994, the second break in the case came clear as daylight. A boot print, left in the mud just outside the killer's latest dumping site. It had rained earlier that evening, softening the ground just enough for his foot to leave a perfect impression as he dragged his victim into the woods. Investigators had long suspected the Phantom was familiar with outdoor survival and traversal. His movements through Black Lake's dense forests and remote trails were too precise to belong to someone unfamiliar with nature. But this print confirmed what detectives had started piecing together over the years. Their killer wasn't just someone who visited Black Lake, he belonged here. Maybe he'd lived here his whole life. The boot print, matched against common outdoor footwear, pointed investigators to a specific line of boots frequently sold at a small outfitter's store in the area. The store owner, upon being questioned, remembered something vague, a handful of customers purchasing that specific style of boot over the years. He couldn't say for certain which of them stood out, but his records provided a starting point. Detectives began narrowing their list of suspects. It wasn't perfect, but the Phantom wasn't anonymous anymore. His edges were beginning to blur into something identifiable. Back in the lab, the forensics team discovered something else extraordinary. A closer examination of the DNA extracted from the hair showed markers indicating mixed European ancestry. The Phantom wasn't just a shadow anymore. He had origins, a history, characteristics buried within his genetic identity. At the same time, investigators pulled together profiles of every known male in the area who fit the newly formed psychological and physical patterns. One suspect in particular began to draw their attention. A name quietly slipping its way through the growing case files. Craig Milton. Craig wasn't a stranger in Black Lake. He worked in maintenance for the local resorts and fishing lodges that dotted the area, spending much of his time alone on the trails and roads surrounding the lake. His profession gave him the perfect cover. A man who blended into the scenery, an unassuming presence whose familiarity made him nearly invisible. And then came the final coincidence. Craig owned a pair of those boots, the exact brand and size that matched the print found in the mud. Investigators began piecing together details about Craig's routine, scrutinizing his movements over the past few years. Suspicions solidified into certainty. The once phantom figure haunting Black Lake now had a name, a face, and most importantly, undeniable evidence tying him to his crimes. He had made one critical error, and law enforcement had found the thread that would eventually unravel his web of terror. The Phantom's reign was beginning to crumble. The suspicious man. As the investigation finally gained momentum, a name surfaced that sent chills through the Black Lake Task Force. Craig Milton. For years he had walked among the people of Black Lake as nothing but an unassuming figure. He was the kind of man who would buy his morning coffee at the local diner, nod politely to the waitress, and leave exact change on the counter. Nobody gave him a second glance, and that anonymity was his greatest weapon. Craig worked as a maintenance technician for several of the isolated fishing lodges and resorts scattered around Black Lake. His job often required him to travel the wooded back roads, moving between properties to fix plumbing, electrical systems, and other repairs. He wasn't sociable. To most people he was simply the maintenance guy. Sparse interactions contributed to his invisibility. He appeared trustworthy enough not to raise suspicion, but distant enough to avoid close relationships. In plain sight for years. From the outside, Craig seemed like the picture of mediocrity. In his early 40s, he lived alone in a modest, rundown cabin on the outskirts of town that blended perfectly with the rural landscape. He had no family nearby, no spouse, and no children. There were whispers in town that he'd come to Black Lake after some trouble back in his hometown, but nobody. Small towns like Black Lake knew how to turn a blind eye to past secrets, especially when it was easier than digging them up. But as investigators delved deeper into Craig Milton's life, the ordinary facade he had spent so long perfecting, the boots that matched the print found at one of the crime scenes, Craig Milton owned them. His frequent trips along the secluded trails and roads, they lined up eerily well with the areas where many of the victims had been discovered. And then there were his habits. Patterns carefully preserved through observation and quiet routine that, when pieced together, painted a chilling portrait of a man who knew this town and its secrets far too well. The more the task force, the more Craig Milton began to stand out as the perfect kind of predator, methodical, patient, and forgotten by almost everyone around him. The forensic team scored its first breakthrough with the DNA marker taken from the crime scene. While no direct match appeared in the national database, the results revealed genetic traits consistent with mixed European ancestry, features that aligned with Craig's physical description: pale complexion, dark brown eyes, a wiry build, and short-cropped hair that had already begun to gray at the temples. It wasn't enough to arrest him, but it was getting close. Detective Ortiz, whose obsession with the case had grown, spent weeks tailing Craig Milton. What struck him wasn't how suspicious the man appeared, but how completely normal he seemed. Craig followed a set schedule: morning shifts repairing the cabins, quiet evenings at the local hardware store or reading on the porch of his cabin. He interacted sparingly, and did just enough to maintain the image of harmlessness that had kept him out of the spotlight for so long. But even the most careful monsters leave behind trails. And as Ortiz dug into Craig's past, he uncovered a history that couldn't be ignored. In his late 20s, Craig had been arrested for a domestic violence incident involving a girlfriend back in his... Though the charges were ultimately dropped, the case file painted a grim image, a jealous, controlling man with a propensity for anger. Co-workers from his past described him as quiet but off, a loner who didn't handle rejection well. Some went so far as to call him a ticking time bomb. Curiously, one detail stood out among Craig's past. Shortly after his arrest, he abruptly relocated to Black Lake. There was no clear reason for the move, but investigators suspected that it wasn't just about starting over. Black Lake, with its sprawling forests and isolated trails, seemed almost tailor-made for someone looking to hide, and perhaps, hunt. Neighbors in the area described Craig in mixed tones. Some called him polite, even helpful, recounting times he had repaired broken fences or lent a hand with car troubles, but others admitted they always found something odd about him. "He never really looked you in the eyes," said one local. "And he was always watching, like he noticed things that most people didn't." A waitress at the diner vaguely remembered how Craig always sat in the corner booth facing the front door. At the time it seemed harmless, a preference, nothing more, but in hindsight it came across as calculated, like he needed to keep an eye on everyone coming and going. There were darker whispers too. Some women spoke of moments that hadn't seemed alarming at first, Craig standing a little too close, holding their gaze a little too long, asking personal questions in a way that felt invasive, even if the words themselves weren't threatening. "He made your skin crawl," one woman admitted, "but you couldn't explain why." Armed with this growing list of circumstantial evidence, the task force began surveilling Craig more closely. They obtained a warrant to search his property, but they were cautious not to stir him yet. Craig Milton lived simply, no television, no photos on his walls, and only a handful of personal items cluttering his one-room cabin. Yet, the silence within those walls felt like an accusation in itself. Investigators combing through his belongings found traces of what they were looking for: maps of the surrounding woods marked with trails and notes, a collection of survival gear that included ropes and tools eerily similar to the bindings used on some of the victims, and a knife with a blade stained by something too old to identify at first glance. But it was in the crawl space beneath his cabin that they made the most damning discovery. Hidden among piles of moldy cardboard boxes were small objects, souvenirs from lives that had been violently ended: a necklace, a pair of earrings, a faded photograph with a smiling face that would later be matched to one of the missing victims. These items weren't just trophies, they were proof that Craig Milton hadn't just stumbled upon these women by chance. He had studied them, targeted them, and carried pieces of their lives with him after he had stolen them away. Still, the evidence wasn't enough to charge him outright. Investigators lacked the definitive link, the smoking gun that could prove Craig Milton was the Phantom of Black Lake. But Detective Ortiz knew they were circling closer than ever before. Craig's careful veneer was beginning to fracture under the weight of his own mistakes and the growing scrutiny surrounding him. Each additional discovery chipped away at the wall of anonymity he had spent so long building. Craig Milton had once been a phantom, untouchable and invisible. Now, he was a man on the edge. The unexpected confession. Craig Milton's arrest was supposed to be the culmination of years of tireless work, a moment of triumph for the town of Black Lake, a chance for justice and closure. The evidence against him wasn't airtight, not yet. The DNA match was still pending, the circumstantial evidence was stacked high but incomplete, and the small-town task force braced for a prolonged battle in court to ensure he'd never walk free again. But what nobody anticipated, what no one could have even imagined, was that Craig wouldn't fight back. Instead, he gave the police exactly what they had hoped for, but in the most chilling way possible: a confession. It wasn't immediate. When the officers first placed him in the sterile gray interrogation room late one cold March evening, Craig remained silent. His wiry frame sat stiff and still, his hands cuffed in front of him on the scratched steel tabletop. He didn't flinch when they read him his rights, didn't react when they laid out the charges against him. He simply stared at the wall behind Detective Samuel Ortiz, as though absorbing the memory of it before saying goodbye to the outside world forever. Ortiz leaned forward, his voice steady but edged with suppressed anger. "You know why you're here, Craig. We know what you've done. We just need you to say it." But Craig didn't. Not then. Hours passed as the clock's ticking seemed to grow louder, each second punctuating the silence like a heartbeat. The detectives took turns, trying various methods to get him to talk: calm reasoning, antagonistic confrontations, even veiled threats of what awaited him with a lifetime sentence in prison. Still, no reaction. Craig watched them the way a cat watches a mouse, detached yet undeniably aware of everything happening in the room. "Look at me," Ortiz finally snapped, his patience thinning. "You think you're smarter than all of us, don't you? But we have you. The DNA, the boot print. You slipped up, Craig. You're not invincible." For the first time, Craig shifted his gaze. His dark eyes locked on Ortiz's with dispassionate precision, sending a jolt of unease through the room. When he finally spoke, his voice was calm and unsettlingly casual, like he was talking about the weather. "Do you even know how many there were?" Ortiz froze. His mind raced to catch up with the meaning of Craig's words. "How many what?" he asked, even though he already knew the answer. "The women," Craig said simply. "Or, does that not matter to you?" Silence gripped the room like a vice. Ortiz glanced at his partner, Detective Laura Price, whose face had gone pale. It hit them both at once. Craig wasn't denying anything. He wasn't trying to deflect or lie. He was offering. Ortiz forced his voice to remain steady. "Why don't you tell us, Craig? How many?" Craig lifted his hands as much as the cuffs would allow and rubbed his temples as though genuinely trying to recall a forgotten grocery list. 35, he said after a moment. "Maybe more. It's hard to remember." The air seemed to shift, heavy with the kind of suffocating weight that only true, unfiltered horror could bring. Ortiz leaned back, his mind spinning. 35. 35 women had been stolen from their families, their lives snuffed out by the man sitting calmly before them like he was talking about roadkill, and the way he said it, flat, unfeeling, stripped the moment of any humanity. "Why?" Price finally whispered, breaking her silence. Her voice cracked on the single word. "Why did you do it?" Craig's lips twitched into something that might have been mistaken for a smile if there had been any warmth in it. "You wouldn't understand," he said. "None of you can. It's not about hate or revenge or whatever you people think drives someone like me. It's control. You take one life and suddenly everything in the world feels like it makes sense. For those moments, you're the one steering the ship." He laughed softly, a hollow, chilling sound that seemed to echo off the walls. "Black Lake was perfect, you know. Quiet, isolated, nobody watching too closely. People here don't ask questions when someone goes missing. And the woods? A playground. Everything I needed." Ortiz clenched his fists beneath the table, his nails digging into his palms. He wanted to scream at Craig, to curse him, to demand an ounce of remorse. But there was no point. Remorse wasn't something Craig Milton possessed. The man sitting across from him wasn't tormented or haunted by guilt. He was proud, almost amused, like a chess grandmaster reviewing the long and elaborate checkmate he had so carefully orchestrated. "What changed?" Ortiz asked, his voice tight. "Why confess now?" Craig leaned back in his chair, the steel cuffs clanking against the table as he tilted his head, studying Ortiz like one might study a particularly interesting insect. "Why not? You've already got me," he said casually. Then, after a beat, he added, "Besides, I wanted you to know just how much you missed." Ortiz's jaw tightened, but he didn't take the bait. Craig's confession wasn't about guilt, not in the way the world understood it. It was about power, another game in which he remained in control. Even when cornered, he was manipulating the narrative, ensuring that his final chapters were written on his own terms. Over the next several days, Craig expanded on his confession in painstaking, sickening detail. He described how he had stalked his victims, blending into the background of their lives so seamlessly that they never saw him coming. He explained his process for choosing his prey, always targeting women who were vulnerable, overlooked, or living on the margins, those whose disappearances wouldn't immediately raise alarm. "There's an art to it," he said during one chilling interview. "You pick someone the world's already forgotten, and nobody notices for weeks they're even gone. By then, they've already disappeared into the woods." Craig laid out his timeline with unnerving precision, recounting details that only he could know, where the bodies had been dumped, items he had taken as trophies, the way his victims had screamed or pleaded or fought back before succumbing. "The ones who fought," he said almost wistfully, "they made it fun." Even as his confession handed detectives their first solid leads on several cold cases, it became increasingly clear that Craig Milton wasn't confessing out of guilt. He wasn't remorseful. Every word he spoke came laced with a simmering arrogance, as though he wanted the world to marvel at the years of violence he had orchestrated without detection. And when he finally revealed one last chilling secret, that there were likely more victims he had forgotten, buried in places even he couldn't remember, Detective Ortiz had to excuse himself from the room. Hearing Craig admit so flippantly to a body count that might never fully be reconciled was too much, even for him. Craig's confession rocked Black Lake to its core. The Phantom of Black Lake wasn't just a shadow anymore. He was a man, tangible and monstrous, whose crimes had been hidden in plain sight for years. For the families of the victims, his words brought a bittersweet kind of closure. They finally knew what had happened to their loved ones, but it wasn't the kind of answer anyone wanted. And for Ortiz, who had spent years chasing a phantom, Craig's unexpected confession was both a victory and a nightmare, proof that even when you catch the monster, the scars he's left behind may never truly heal. The sentence. The trial of Craig Milton was nothing short of a local and national spectacle, a courtroom drama that unfolded with all the weight and gravity of the horrors it sought to address. The sleepy town of Black Lake, once known only as a quiet fishing retreat, became the center of a media storm. Vans packed with reporters lined the courthouse steps as photographers scrambled for shots of the man who had come to be known as the Phantom of Black Lake. Inside the courtroom, a sea of faces, victims' families, curious locals, and legal observers, sat silently, the air thick with anticipation. From the moment Milton entered the courtroom, escorted by two stoic guards, it was clear to everyone in attendance that he wasn't burdened by guilt or shame. His demeanor was eerily calm, eerily normal. Despite months in jail awaiting his trial, Milton hadn't lost the quiet, unassuming aura that had allowed him to evade justice for so many years. He wore a plain gray suit, his hair neatly combed, and his wire-rimmed glasses perched delicately on his nose. If someone had wandered into the room without context, they might have mistaken him for an accountant or schoolteacher caught in the wrong place at the wrong time, but everyone knew better. The monster was no longer lurking in the shadows, he was sitting in plain sight. The prosecution presented their case with surgical precision, beginning with the gruesome details of Milton's crimes. They described in harrowing clarity how he had stalked his victims, manipulated their trust, and struck with calculated brutality. Among the evidence was the DNA recovered from the hair at one crime scene, the boot print found in the mud near another, and the personal items, trophies from his victims, discovered beneath the floorboards of his cabin. Each piece of evidence painted an undeniable truth. Craig Milton had orchestrated a reign of terror over Black Lake, and he had done so with chilling disregard for human life. Linda Harrington's testimony was a key moment in the trial, her voice steady but raw, as she recounted her near escape from Milton's clutches. "He looked like any other guy," she told the court, her hands gripping the edges of the witness stand. "You'd never think twice about him if you saw him at the grocery store or at a gas station, but behind that face, behind those glasses, he was a predator." Her words hung in the air, unshakable and irreversible. The defense, either out of desperation or obligation, tried to soften the edges of Milton's image. They spoke of his troubled upbringing in a broken home, his struggles with isolation and mental health, and the lack of resources available to him as a young man. They argued that he wasn't born a killer, that life had pushed him into the abyss. But these arguments fell flat in the face of his own chilling confession. Milton had spoken freely, almost eagerly, about his crimes, recounting details that no sane person could twist into an interpretation of innocence. He chose to do what he did, and no sob story could soften the cold, hard facts. Perhaps the most haunting moment of the trial came when the prosecution played taped recordings of Milton's confessions. These weren't just statements, they were revelations, spoken in his calm, detached voice, punctuated by occasional chuckles that sent shivers up the spines of everyone in the room. "When I realized how easy it was," he said on one recording, "it became addicting. Like catching fish, you know? You find the right spot, you throw out the line, and you wait. The fun is in the waiting. The knowing that they're coming, that you're about to pull them out of the water." The courtroom sat in stunned silence as the recording continued. Mothers clutched their hands to their mouths. Fathers shook with barely contained rage. Family members of the victims wept openly, some rushing out into the hallway, unable to bear hearing Milton speak so casually of the unspeakable. Detective Ortiz, who had spent years chasing the Phantom of Black Lake, was also called to testify. His face was heavy with exhaustion, his voice tinged with the weight of the memories he carried. "I've worked murder cases before," Ortiz said, staring directly at the jury, "but nothing like this. You go home at night after seeing the things this man left behind, and you can't turn it off. The images, the screams you imagine were there. This wasn't just murder, it was something darker. He didn't feel human anymore. When it came time for Milton to speak in his own defense, the room held its breath. Would he break down, beg for mercy, deny everything despite the evidence against him? The answer came in the form of an unnervingly calm statement. "I know you all want me to say I'm sorry, that I regret what I did." He adjusted his glasses and smiled faintly, a predator's smile. "But I'm not going to stand here and lie to you. I did it, every bit of it, and I wouldn't change a thing." The gasp that followed those words rippled through the room like a tidal wave. If anyone had held out hope that Milton might possess even a shred of remorse, it was extinguished in an instant. The man wasn't just unrepentant, he was proud. It wasn't a difficult decision for the jury. After deliberating for less than 3 hours, they returned with their verdict. Guilty on all counts. 35 confirmed murders with the strong suspicion of many more. Milton showed no reaction as the foreman read the verdict, folding his hands in front of him with an air of almost serene indifference. Then came the sentencing. Life without the possibility of parole. For each victim, a separate life sentence was issued, ensuring that Milton would never see the outside of a prison cell again. As the judge rendered her decision, her voice trembling with barely repressed emotion, she stared Milton down. "You are a predator of the worst kind," she said, her voice cutting through the room like a knife. "You preyed upon the vulnerable, the forgotten, the desperate, but today you are powerless. Today justice has come for you." Some in the gallery wept, others clapped quietly. Families of the victims held tight to one another, united in their grief and their relief that the nightmare was finally over, or at least as over as it could ever be. Milton, as always, remained stone-faced, his eyes fixed on some invisible horizon. For him, the trial wasn't a reckoning, it was simply the end of the game. He had lost, but even in defeat, he carried himself not as the prey, but as a predator, still basking in the power of the pain he had caused. As he was escorted out of the courtroom, a line of police officers followed closely, ensuring order. Outside, reporters shouted questions at him, their microphones jostling for position. Milton ignored them all, stepping into the waiting transport van that would take him to the place he'd call home for the rest of his life. A maximum security prison where he'd spend his remaining days as just another forgotten soul behind concrete walls and steel bars. But for Black Lake, the scars he left would not heal so easily. Though the trial ended in the only way it could, the weight of what Milton had done would hang over the community like a storm cloud for years to come. The terrifying legacy. The capture and conviction of Craig Milton, the Phantom of Black Lake, should have felt like the end of a nightmare. In many ways it was. For years, the town surrounding Black Lake had lived under a dark, suffocating shadow. Parents locked their doors at night, women traveled in pairs or not at all, and the solemn hum of fear hung over every street, every unlit trail and every gentle ripple of the lake's waters. Now, at long last, the Phantom was behind bars, stripped of his freedom, his tools, and his power. But freedom from fear is not the same as healing. Milton's reign of terror had carved scars far deeper than anyone cared to admit. Black Lake would never be the same, and neither would its people. The legacy of his horrifying crimes lingered on every corner. For the families of his victims, the loss remained an open wound. No amount of justice or years in prison could bring back their daughters, sisters, or mothers. During Milton's trial, some had clung to the hope that knowing the truth would bring closure. But what they got was something darker, a deeper understanding of not only what Craig Milton had done, but how he had done it. He had targeted those who were most vulnerable, women whose lives had already been shaped by struggle, invisibility, or desperation. Learning that their loved ones had been stalked, manipulated, and brutalized by a man who walked among them like a neighbor, smiling and nodding in their direction, only added to the weight of their grief. Everywhere you looked in Black Lake, ghosts seemed to linger. The lodge where Milton worked became a grim attraction for out-of-town curiosity seekers, forcing its owners to shut down for good. The woods surrounding the lake, once a serene haven for hikers and campers, now carried an ominous reputation that no amount of rebranding could fix. Signs posted at trailheads, "Stay on well-lit paths" or "Travel in groups," stood as permanent reminders of the horrors that had unfolded in the shadows. For many of the locals, Milton's crimes altered their sense of trust. The idea that someone they had passed in the grocery store, waved at on the side of the road, or exchanged pleasantries with in the diner could also be a cold-blooded killer shook them to their core. Fear began to infect the small-town camaraderie they once prided themselves on. Neighbors became suspicious of one another. Strangers were no longer welcomed with warm smiles but scrutinized with quiet paranoia. Could another predator be out there? Were they safe now, or just waiting for the next shadow to emerge? Local businesses felt the fallout too. Tourism, which had once been a lifeline for Black Lake's economy, dwindled to a trickle. Travelers who used to come for fishing trips or cabin getaways now bypassed the area altogether, drawn instead to places whose names weren't tied to headlines about cold-blooded murders and unspeakable violence. The once thriving marina stood eerily silent, its docks half-rotted and boats covered with tarps that billowed in the wind like forgotten ghosts. But perhaps the most unsettling part of Milton's legacy was the question of how he had thrived undetected for so long. Years after his sentencing, residents still found themselves haunted by the same morbid thought: what if we had noticed sooner? People combed back through memories of Craig Milton, moments that had once seemed insignificant, now reframed through a chilling lens. "I remember he fixed my car once," said one woman in a rare interview for the local paper. "He didn't talk much, just smiled and left. But now I think about it, I remember how he watched me. The way he looked at me when he thought I wasn't paying attention. It makes my skin crawl that I didn't see it for what it was." For the survivors, like Linda Harrington, the legacy of Black Lake's phantom didn't fade once Milton was locked away. Linda's escape had been a turning point in the case, a lucky moment that had given investigators the thread they needed to unravel years of violence. But survival came with a cost. Linda struggled daily with the trauma of what she had endured. She moved away from Black Lake shortly after Milton's trial, unable to walk the town's familiar streets without feeling his shadow there, creeping just over her shoulder. "I'll never be free of him," she admitted in an emotional interview with a national news outlet. "I made it out alive, but he still gets into my head. The nightmares, the memories, they don't go away just because he's in prison. He took so much more than lives. He took peace. He took safety." Detective Samuel Ortiz and the rest of the Black Lake Task Force carried similar burdens. For Ortiz, Milton's arrest wasn't a victory as much as it was the end of a personal obsession. The detective had poured years of his life into tracking Milton, mapping his crimes and staring through the lens of his twisted world. But in doing so, Ortiz confessed, he had lost parts of himself along the way, time with his family, his health, and his belief in the world as he once knew it. "You think catching him would be the end," Ortiz told a reporter years later, looking older and wearier than anyone who remembered him during the case. "But it's hard to walk away from something like that. It gets under your skin. Every victim we missed, every woman we couldn't save sits with me. Worse, he wanted us to feel that way. And we do." Milton's crimes entered the folklore of Black Lake, passed down in whispers to children who grew up knowing only a town haunted by its name. Stories took on a life of their own, exaggerated and warped through the lens of fear. Parents used tales of the Phantom to scare their kids into good behavior, while teens dared each other to spend a night near the woods where Milton's victims had been found. But behind every story, behind every exaggerated rumor was the grim truth. Craig Milton had been real, and his darkness wasn't the stuff of myths. It had lived here, thrived here, and forever changed the people who called Black Lake home. What truly cemented Milton's terrifying legacy, however, was a chilling reality no one could fully escape. Despite his confession, authorities were never able to locate all his victims. Milton had been cunning, and many of the women he claimed remained missing, lost in the dense woods, buried in shallow graves the forest had reclaimed, or hidden in places only he knew. He had toyed with investigators during his interviews, dropping hints about locations only to withhold the final details. "Some secrets," Milton said with a faint smile during one final interrogation, "are meant to stay buried." And with that, he left the investigators and the families of the missing with one final torment. How many would never be found? How many graves would remain unmarked, their stories untold? For Black Lake, Craig Milton wasn't just a name, he was a scar, a permanent mark on the town's spirit and memory. Though life crawled forward in the years after his capture, there was no undoing what he had done. The once idyllic community in the heart of the eastern United States had become synonymous with horror, its name etched into books and documentaries as the backdrop for one of the most disturbing crime sprees in modern history. And while Milton rotted away in his prison cell, his face no longer seen and his voice no longer heard, his presence lingered, etched into the trees, the dirt trails, the rippling, silent waters of Black Lake.